Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 5, Lesson 9, Spawning Enemies. Now, so far in our game, we have our enemies set up, and we can destroy them, and they can cause damage to the player. But we don't just want to be placing enemies statically in the level. We want to be able to spawn them into the level to create a much more dynamic experience for the player. So in this lesson, we'll create an enemy spawner class that can spawn enemies into the level. And then we'll demonstrate a couple different methods for spawning enemies into our level, using a trigger, a timer, or a mixture of the two. Here in my blueprints folder, and then under the enemy folder, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this spawning. And in here, I want to create a blueprint class. It's going to be an actor. I'm going to call this enemy spawner. And I'll need to know what type of enemy I want to spawn, because we'll be able to select from different enemy types. So let's add a variable, and we'll call this enemy class. And the variable type will be enemy base, and we want a class reference. Now on begin play, we can type spawn actor, and we can grab our enemy class. And then for the transform, we could just say get world transform. And our enemy class, we want to make sure that we set it to one of our enemy types. Let's start by setting it as our BP darter. Now here in my game, I'm going to drag one of these in. And again, make sure that for every enemy we're spawning, that the Z is going to be 0. And that way we're locking them into the same plane as our player. And if I rotate this 180 degrees, we'll spawn an enemy at this location going towards the player. And there we have it. One thing that I think is helpful in this is we'll add an arrow, and that way we can see which direction they'll be spawning when we place them into the world. And you can even select this arrow component and make it larger. And now I'm going to delete these two enemies from my level, and we'll only use the enemy spawner from now on to add enemies in. So I'm going to have this selected. I'm going to hold Alt. I'm going to drag to the side, and that way we can create multiple enemies. And there we see we had multiple enemies spawn into the level. But I don't want all of my enemies to spawn as soon as the game starts. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take all of this, I'm going to collapse it to a function, and I'm going to call this spawn enemy. And I want to demonstrate that we can set this to a timer. So I could drag off here and say set timer, and we'll set a timer for our spawn enemy function. And let's just set the timer right now to something like 2 seconds. And then I want to drag this off, and I want to promote it to a variable, and we'll call this spawn delay. Now after 2 seconds, our enemies are spawned into the world. Now one thing also, we may want to have a spawner spawn multiple enemies from the same location. For instance, if we decided to use our chaser, we may want to spawn more than one at each of those locations. So let's create another variable. I'm going to call this number of enemies. And this can be an integer. And right now let's just set this to 2. Now, after I spawn an enemy, I want to get that, and I want to decrement it. And then I want to create a branch and see if this is less than or equal to 0. And if it is, we'll clear timer of spawn enemy. And now we just need to make sure that this is set to looping. So now every 2 seconds we should spawn until we've spawned the number of enemies. 2, 2. So now that's working as well. But we want to be able to set all of these variables on each instance of the spawner that we set in the world. So let's make all of these instance editable. Now each of these in our world, we could see that we could set the enemy class, the spawn delay, and the number of enemies. So let's create so that only one of these spawns multiples, but we want that one to spawn 3. And we can even set one of them to spawn a darter. So now that the timer is working, let's set up another actor that would allow us to spawn using a trigger. Let's right click here and we'll create a child blueprint of our enemy spawner. And I'm going to call this enemy spawner with trigger. And then I want to create another new actor. I'm going to call this spawn trigger. And for this, I want to add a box collider. And I want to make this box collider much wider so it would go across the entire player's screen. So on the y-axis, let's stretch it by 20. And just for right now, I'm going to not hide this in game so I can see the size of it. So yeah, that needs to be much wider. And there we go. Now it's crossing the entire player's screen. And here in my spawn trigger, I want to set up an event dispatcher. And I want to call this spawn enemy trigger. Now, using my actor begin overlap, let's cast to player ship. And if this cast is successful, let's call this. And then we can destroy the actor. And we're going to create a system similar to the one we used in the haunted house puzzle, where we have these spawn triggers that have a number associated with them, and then our spawner has a number as well. And if they're matched to each other, then this will be called. So let's create a new variable here on our spawn trigger called trigger ID. And this can be an integer. And then here in our enemy spawner with trigger, let's get all actors. And we want our spawn trigger. And let's do a for each. And if the trigger ID is equal to a number, and we can drag this off and create a variable here called spawner ID, then we can bind event to spawn enemy trigger, and we'll create a custom event, and we'll call this spawn. And here we can set timer. So in the end, we're doing the exact same thing that we did in our enemy spawner, but we only want this to happen if this spawner ID matches the trigger ID. And this spawner ID does need to be instance editable, as well as the trigger ID. So let's test this out. We have a spawn trigger in here, and let's just call this trigger 1. Now we can drag in enemy spawner with trigger, and we can set the spawner ID to 1 as well. And let's set the spawn delay to 0. We want this to happen as soon as the player interacts with this trigger. And just to show that this is working, let's create 2 more. One with a spawner ID of 1 and one with a spawner ID of 2. So what we're expecting now is that these 2 will spawn when the player interacts with the trigger, but this one will not. And there we go. And we can also drag another one of these off and set the trigger ID to 2. And now this spawner should trigger when we interact with this trigger. Just to simplify things, let's delete some of these extra ones. And it looks like I created a bug here. The spawn delay cannot be set to 0 because then this will essentially never be called. So I've just set up my spawn delay to 0.1 on all of them. And now the first 2 spawn, and when I interact with this one, the third one will spawn. And we can just experiment with this by putting a bunch of them into the level. And now that we have these spawners set up, we can see that our game is really starting to come together. In the last lesson for this week, we're just going to wrap up by tidying up a few things to our game before we move on to week 6. So I'll see you in the next lesson.